The morning fog hung thick over Windsor Castle as Captain James Morrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be the last time. 23 years of unwavering service to the crown had brought him to this moment, standing outside the most prestigious law firm in London, clutching a briefcase that contained enough evidence to shake the very foundations of the monarchy. James had never imagined his life would take such a dramatic turn. Born into a working-class family in Manchester, he had joined the Royal Guard with dreams of honor, duty, and service. His father, a factory worker, had beamed with pride the day James received his commission. "You'll serve something greater than yourself, son," his father had said, tears glistening in his weathered eyes. For over 2 decades, James had lived by those words. He had protected 3 generations of royals, witnessed their most private moments, and kept their secrets locked away in the depths of his loyal heart. But loyalty, he had learned, was not always a two-way street. The trouble began 3 years ago when Queen Consort Eleanor arrived at the palace. Beautiful, charismatic, and seemingly devoted to her royal duties, she had quickly won over the public and the press. But behind the carefully orchestrated public appearances and charitable galas, James had witnessed a different side of the woman who would help shape the future of the crown. It started with small things that made him uncomfortable. Private meetings with foreign dignitaries that were not recorded in official logs. Expensive gifts that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Phone calls conducted in hushed tones, always ending abruptly when staff approached. As the head of her personal security detail, James was privy to these moments, but his training had taught him to observe, protect, and remain silent. The first real red flag came during a state visit from the president of Moldova. James had been stationed outside the Queen Consort's private study when he heard raised voices. Through the heavy oak door, he could make out fragments of conversation that made his blood run cold. Words like arms deals, offshore accounts, and 10% commission floated through the air like poison. When the meeting ended, James quickly moved to his designated position, but not before catching a glimpse of the Moldovan president slipping a thick envelope into his briefcase. Eleanor emerged moments later, her usual composure intact, but James noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed down her dress. That night, James lay awake in his modest quarters within the castle grounds, wrestling with what he had witnessed. His training dictated silence, but his conscience screamed for action. He thought of his oath of loyalty, of the generations of trust placed in him, of the weight of the crown he had sworn to protect. But he also thought of the innocent people who might suffer if weapons found their way into the wrong hands. Over the following months, James began to pay closer attention. He started keeping a private journal, documenting the irregularities he witnessed. Late-night visitors who entered through service entrances. Suitcases that arrived empty and left full. Conversations conducted in languages he didn't recognize, but that left Eleanor looking satisfied and wealthy donors looking nervous. The breaking point came during the annual Children's Charity Gala, an event Eleanor had championed as her signature cause. The evening was meant to raise funds for orphaned children across the Commonwealth. James watched as Eleanor delivered a moving speech about protecting the innocent, her voice breaking with apparent emotion as she spoke of children sleeping in the streets. But later that night, James discovered something that would haunt him forever. While conducting his routine security sweep, he found Eleanor in her private office, not alone, but with Viktor Petrov, a known arms dealer whom James recognized from intelligence briefings. Petrov was sliding bundles of cash across Eleanor's desk while photos of the charity event played silently on her computer screen. 60% as agreed, Petrov was saying in his thick Russian accent. The charity provides perfect cover for our South African operations. No one questions humanitarian aid shipments. Eleanor's response chilled James to the bone. Make sure the children's photos look authentic for the marketing materials. The public responds better to emotional appeals. And ensure our weapons reach the militia groups as planned. The destabilization of the region will create more demand for our services. James felt sick. The woman he had sworn to protect was using a children's charity as a front for international arms dealing. She was exploiting images of suffering children to fuel conflicts that would create even more orphans. The moral weight of what he had discovered threatened to crush him. For weeks, James agonized over his options. He could report what he had seen to his superiors, but Eleanor's influence ran deep within the palace hierarchy. He could approach the media, but without concrete proof, it would be his word against that of a beloved royal figure. He could continue to remain silent and complicit in activities that violated every principle he held dear. The decision became clear when James discovered Eleanor's most horrific secret. Hidden in a secure folder on her computer, which he accessed during a routine security check, were photographs and documents that revealed the true scope of her operations. Children from the very orphanages her charity claimed to support were being trafficked to conflict zones, not as victims to be rescued, but as child soldiers to be armed with the weapons Eleanor's network provided. The images haunted James. Young faces, some no older than his own nephew, holding assault rifles nearly as tall as they were. Bills of sale that listed training materials and educational supplies alongside quantities of ammunition and explosives. Contracts signed in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting authorizing shipments to regions torn apart by civil war. James knew he could no longer remain silent. His loyalty to the crown was sacred, but his duty to protect innocent lives was even more fundamental. That night, he began copying files, photographing documents, and recording conversations. Every piece of evidence felt like a betrayal of his oath, but also like a step toward redemption. The investigation took months. James worked carefully, methodically building a case that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. He reached out to international journalists, human rights organizations, and law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. Slowly, a network of allies formed around him, people who shared his determination to expose the truth, regardless of the consequences. The hardest part was maintaining his facade of loyalty while gathering evidence of Eleanor's crimes. Every morning, he had to look her in the eye, bow respectfully, and say, "Your Majesty," knowing that she was responsible for untold suffering. Every security briefing felt like a performance, every official event like an elaborate lie. James's health began to suffer under the stress. He lost weight, developed insomnia, and found himself jumping at shadows. His colleagues noticed the change, but James attributed it to the pressures of his position. Only his sister Sarah, a nurse in Manchester, knew something was deeply wrong when James visited her one weekend and broke down crying while holding her infant son. "I've done something terrible," he had whispered. "Or maybe I'm about to do something terrible. I don't know the difference anymore." Sarah had held her brother as he sobbed, not pressing for details, but offering the unconditional support that only family could provide. "You're the most honorable man I know, Jamie," she had said, using his childhood nickname. "Whatever you decide, it will be the right thing." Those words gave James the strength to continue. As winter approached, he finalized his preparations. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing millions of pounds flowing through Eleanor's personal accounts, shipping manifests revealing weapons disguised as humanitarian supplies, recordings of conversations that explicitly outlined illegal arms deals, and, most damaging of all, the photographs and documents proving the exploitation of children. The law firm James approached was known for taking on seemingly impossible cases against powerful institutions. Senior partner Margaret Whitfield, a woman whose reputation for integrity was matched only by her fearless pursuit of justice, listened for 3 hours as James presented his evidence. When he finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of an antique clock. "Captain Morrison," Margaret finally said, "what you're alleging could bring down the monarchy. Are you prepared for the consequences of such an action?" James met her gaze steadily. "Ma'am, I've served the crown faithfully for 23 years. But I cannot serve a crown that profits from the suffering of innocent children. If that makes me a traitor, then I accept that burden." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then we proceed. But understand this, once we file this lawsuit, there will be no going back. Your life, your reputation, everything you've known will change forever." As James left the law firm that evening, he felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. The fog was lifting from the city, and for the first time in months, he could see clearly. Tomorrow, the world would learn the truth about Queen Consort Eleanor. Tomorrow, his own world would likely come crashing down. But tonight, for the first time in years, Captain James Morrison would sleep with a clear conscience, knowing that he had chosen justice over comfort, truth over loyalty, and the protection of innocent lives over his own security. The little boy from Manchester who had dreamed of serving something greater than himself had finally found his true calling, even if it meant losing everything he had worked for in the process. The next morning would bring headlines that would shock the world, but tonight belonged to a man who had rediscovered his soul in the act of risking everything to do what was right. The morning sun had barely crested the London skyline when the news broke across every major media outlet in the country. BBC anchors struggled to maintain their composure as they read headlines that seemed too extraordinary to be real. Royal Guard files £100 million lawsuit against Queen Consort scrolled across television screens while radio hosts stammered through reports that would reshape British history. James Morrison sat in Margaret Whitfield's office, watching the chaos unfold on multiple television screens. His hands trembled slightly as he held a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. After months of preparation, the moment had finally arrived, and the reality of what he had done was crashing over him like a tidal wave. "Captain Morrison, we need to prepare for the palace's response," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the situation. "They'll try to discredit you personally before addressing the evidence. Are you ready for that level of scrutiny?" James nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. He had spent the night in a safe house, unable to return to his quarters at Windsor Castle. The life he had known for over 2 decades had ended the moment Margaret filed the lawsuit at precisely 9 o'clock the previous evening. Meanwhile, chaos reigned within the walls of Buckingham Palace. Emergency meetings had been convened before dawn, with senior advisors, legal counsel, and communications experts scrambling to craft a response to the most serious crisis the monarchy had faced in decades. The king himself had been awakened at 5 in the morning, his private secretary delivering the news that would test the very foundations of his reign. Queen Consort Eleanor stood in her private study, the same room where James had witnessed her clandestine meetings with arms dealers. Her usual composure had cracked, revealing the calculating mind beneath the royal facade. She paced back and forth, her silk robe swishing against the Persian carpet as she spoke in urgent whispers to her private lawyer. "How much does he actually know?" Eleanor demanded, her voice sharp with barely controlled panic. What evidence could he possibly have? Her lawyer, a thin man named Charles Pemberton, who specialized in protecting the wealthy from inconvenient truths, spread documents across her desk with shaking hands. "Your Majesty, if even half of what he claims is true, we're facing potential criminal charges for arms trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy. The charity angle alone could result in fraud charges that carry decades in prison." Eleanor's mask of royal dignity slipped further. "You assured me that our operations were untraceable. You said the charity provided perfect legal cover. Ma'am, we never anticipated that someone with Captain Morrison's level of access would turn against us. He was supposed to be loyal, silent, invisible. This level of betrayal is unprecedented in modern royal history." The Queen Consort sank in her chair, the weight of her actions finally catching up with her. For 3 years, she had built an intricate network of illegal operations, using her royal status as cover for activities that generated millions of pounds in personal profit. Arms deals with unstable governments, money laundering through fake charitable organizations, and the exploitation of vulnerable children had all been conducted under the protective umbrella of the crown. The public's initial reaction was one of disbelief and outrage. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds began to gather despite the early hour. Some held signs demanding justice, while others expressed support for the royal family. The division was immediate and stark, with British society finding itself torn between loyalty to the crown and horror at the allegations. Television news programs struggled to process the enormity of the story. Legal experts were hastily called in to explain the implications of a civil lawsuit against a member of the royal family. Constitutional scholars debated whether Eleanor could be prosecuted under normal criminal law or if special royal protections would apply. International news networks picked up the story, broadcasting the scandal across the globe and raising questions about the stability of the British monarchy. James's sister Sarah watched the coverage from her living room in Manchester, tears streaming down her face as she recognized her brother's courage in the face of impossible odds. She had known something was wrong during his last visit, but she never could have imagined the scope of what he was confronting. Now, seeing his name splashed across headlines and his photograph on every news channel, she felt a mixture of pride and terror for what lay ahead. At the law firm, Margaret Whitfield fielded calls from journalists around the world while her team prepared for the legal battle of their careers. The evidence James had provided was extensive and damning, but They knew the royal family's resources were virtually unlimited. This would not be a simple matter of presenting facts and expecting justice to prevail. We need to be prepared for character assassination attempts, Margaret told her associates during an emergency meeting. They'll dig into Captain Morrison's past, question his mental state, suggest financial motives for his accusations. We need to stay focused on the evidence and not let them turn this into a trial of our client's credibility. The palace's response came at noon, delivered by the king's press secretary in a hastily arranged briefing. The statement was carefully crafted, but could not hide the desperation behind its formal language. His Majesty is deeply concerned by the serious allegations made against the Queen Consort. While we cannot comment on ongoing legal proceedings, we categorically deny any wrongdoing and have full confidence that these claims will be proven false. Captain Morrison's allegations appear to be the work of a disturbed individual seeking attention and financial gain. The statement's attempt to portray James as mentally unstable only served to fuel public interest in the case. Social media exploded with debates about royal accountability, with hashtags like #RoyalScandal and #JusticeForJames trending worldwide. Supporters of James praised his courage in speaking truth to power, while royal loyalists dismissed him as a traitor seeking his moment of fame. Eleanor's past began to come under intense scrutiny as journalists dug into her background. Her rise from minor European nobility to Queen Consort had always seemed like a fairy tale, but now reporters were asking harder questions about the sources of her wealth and the nature of her pre-royal connections. Stories emerged about lavish spending that seemed inconsistent with her official income, mysterious business partnerships, and unexplained absences from public duties. International implications of the scandal began to emerge as well. The governments of several countries where Eleanor's alleged arms deals had taken place issued statements calling for full investigations. Human rights organizations demanded access to the orphanages that had supposedly benefited from her charity work. The United Nations announced a review of humanitarian aid operations in regions where conflict had escalated following mysterious weapons shipments. James spent his second day away from the palace in a series of preparation meetings with Margaret's legal team. Every detail of his evidence was scrutinized, every timeline verified, every document authenticated. The lawyers were amazed by the thoroughness of his documentation and the courage it must have taken to gather such comprehensive proof of Eleanor's crimes. Captain Morrison, Margaret said during a break in their preparation, I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I've never seen someone risk so much to expose the truth. You could have remained silent, kept your position, lived comfortably on your royal pension. Why did you choose this path? James was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the London skyline he had protected for so many years. Ma'am, when I joined the Guard, I swore an oath to protect the crown and uphold justice. For 23 years, I believed those were the same thing. But when I saw those photographs of children holding weapons that Eleanor's network had provided, I realized that sometimes protecting justice means challenging the crown itself. By evening, the story had evolved beyond a simple legal case into a national crisis of conscience. Parliament was recalled for an emergency session to discuss the constitutional implications of the allegations. Religious leaders across the country called for prayers and reflection on the moral foundations of the monarchy. Opinion polls showed the public divided almost evenly between those who believed James's allegations and those who stood by the royal family. Eleanor's inner circle began to fracture as the reality of the situation set in. Several of her closest advisors quietly distanced themselves from her, while others prepared their own legal defenses. The arms dealers and corrupt officials who had worked with her scrambled to destroy evidence and flee to countries without extradition treaties with the United Kingdom. As night fell over London, James sat alone in his temporary safe house, watching the news coverage of the storm he had unleashed. The enormity of what he had done was almost overwhelming, but he found strength in the knowledge that he had finally honored the deepest meaning of his oath. He had protected the innocent, upheld justice, and served something greater than himself, even when it meant sacrificing everything he had known and loved. The battle was just beginning, but James Morrison had already won the most important victory of all, the battle for his own soul. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attacks, and new revelations, but tonight he could rest knowing that he had chosen courage over comfort and truth over convenience. The working-class boy from Manchester had become exactly what his father had hoped, a man who served something greater than himself, no matter the cost. The second day of the scandal ended with the palace still reeling, the public still divided, and the truth still fighting to emerge from decades of carefully constructed lies. But change was in the air, and James Morrison's courage had lit a fire that no royal decree could extinguish. 3 weeks after the initial bombshell, the case had transformed from a shocking headline into a grinding legal battle that consumed British society. James Morrison found himself at the center of a media storm unlike anything the country had seen since the death of Princess Diana. Every day brought new revelations, fresh attacks on his character, and mounting evidence that the corruption he had exposed ran far deeper than anyone had initially imagined. The palace's counterattack had been swift and vicious. Private investigators combed through every aspect of James's life, from his school records to his military service to his personal relationships. They leaked selective information to sympathetic journalists, painting him as a disgruntled employee with financial problems and a history of insubordination. Tabloid headlines screamed about his jealous obsession with Eleanor and his desperate grab for money and fame. But for every attack, Margaret Whitfield's team had a devastating response. They released audio recordings of Eleanor's conversations with arms dealers, bank statements showing millions of pounds flowing through accounts linked to her charity, and shipping manifests that proved weapons were being disguised as humanitarian aid. Each new piece of evidence made the palace's denial seem more desperate and less credible. The most damaging revelation came when investigative journalists, inspired by James's courage, uncovered the full scope of Eleanor's child trafficking operation. Working with international law enforcement agencies, they traced a network that extended across 4 continents, involving corrupt officials, mercenary groups, and criminal organizations that specialized in exploiting vulnerable children. In a small village in Somalia, a former child soldier named Amara spoke to cameras with tears in her eyes. She had been taken from the orphanage that Eleanor's charity claimed to support when she was only 12 years old. For 3 years, she had been forced to carry weapons and fight in a conflict that the very charity meant to protect her had helped fuel. The lady with the beautiful smile came to our orphanage, Amara said in halting English, her voice barely above a whisper. She took photographs with us, told us we would have better lives. But the next week, men came with guns and took many of us away. They said the beautiful lady had sold us to them for the war. Similar stories emerged from conflict zones around the world. Children who had trusted the smiling woman in expensive clothes, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare of violence and exploitation. Parents who had given their children to orphanages believing they would receive education and care, not knowing they were feeding a pipeline that supplied child soldiers to whoever could pay Eleanor's price. The psychological toll on James was enormous. He barely slept, surviving on coffee and nervous energy as he prepared for hours of depositions and court appearances. The weight of protecting these children's stories, of ensuring their suffering would not be in vain, pressed down on him constantly. Margaret insisted he see a counselor, understanding that the trauma of what he had witnessed and the pressure of what he was enduring could break even the strongest person. "I keep thinking about my nephew," James told Dr. Patricia Williams during one of their sessions. "He's 7 years old, loves football, and drawing pictures of superheroes. When I see those photographs of children the same age holding assault rifles, I can't reconcile the two realities. How does someone like Eleanor look at a child and see a commodity to be sold?" Dr. Williams listened with professional compassion as James processed the horror of what he had discovered. "You've witnessed evil in its purest form," she said gently. "The important thing to remember is that by speaking out, you've given these children something they've never had before, a voice, a chance for justice, hope for change." Meanwhile, Eleanor's facade was crumbling under the relentless pressure of investigation. The woman who had charmed the public with her grace and humanitarian work was revealed to be a calculating predator who had used her royal status as cover for some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Former associates came forward with stories of her cold indifference to human suffering and her obsession with accumulating wealth and power. Viktor Petrov, the Russian arms dealer who had been captured attempting to flee to Moscow, agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony provided the final pieces of the puzzle, revealing how Eleanor had approached him 3 years earlier with a proposal to use her royal connections and charitable work as cover for international arms trafficking. She was very businesslike, Petrov told investigators during a recorded interview. No emotion, no conscience. She showed me photographs of orphanages and explained how children could be recruited and trained as soldiers. She spoke of human lives like they were inventory in a warehouse. It was chilling, even for someone in my line of work. The royal family found itself in an impossible position. The king, who had genuinely believed in Eleanor's charitable work and had publicly praised her humanitarian efforts, was devastated by the revelations. Palace insiders leaked stories of his sleepless nights and his struggle to reconcile the woman he had married with the monster the evidence revealed her to be. Public opinion continued to shift decisively in James's favor as the evidence mounted. Vigils were held outside Buckingham Palace for the children who had been trafficked and exploited. Support groups formed to rally behind James, calling him a hero who had risked everything to protect the innocent. Members of Parliament from both major parties demanded Eleanor's immediate arrest and prosecution. The international community watched in amazement as the British monarchy faced its greatest crisis in modern history. Foreign governments that had worked with Eleanor's charity launched their own investigations, uncovering evidence of corruption that reached into their own administrations. The scandal threatened to destabilize diplomatic relationships and called into question the entire system of royal diplomatic immunity. Eleanor's psychological state became a source of concern for her remaining supporters. Palace staff reported erratic behavior, violent outbursts, and paranoid accusations against anyone she perceived as disloyal. She refused to eat meals prepared by kitchen staff, convinced they were trying to poison her. She ordered her rooms swept for listening devices daily, certain that James had planted surveillance equipment throughout the palace. The legal proceedings took on a surreal quality as the full scope of the evidence emerged. Margaret Whitfield's team presented a case so comprehensive and damning that even Eleanor's most expensive lawyers began advising her to consider plea negotiations. Financial records showed that she had personally profited by over £50 million from arms sales, while her charity had diverted millions more that should have supported legitimate humanitarian work. James's testimony before the court was broadcast live across the nation, providing the public with their first opportunity to hear directly from the man who had risked everything to expose the truth. His quiet dignity and obvious pain as he recounted what he had witnessed created a powerful moment that crystallized public opinion. "Your Honor," James said during his testimony, "I joined the Royal Guard to serve the Crown and protect the innocent. For 23 years, I believed those were the same mission. When I discovered that the woman I was sworn to protect was trafficking children and fueling conflicts that created more orphans, I had to choose between my oath of silence and my duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. I chose the children, and I would make the same choice again." The courtroom was silent, except for the soft crying of several spectators. Even the judge, a stern woman known for maintaining strict courtroom discipline, was visibly moved by James's words. Outside the courthouse, crowds of supporters cheered as James emerged from his testimony. Signs reading "Hero of the Children" and "Courage over Comfort" filled the streets. Sarah Morrison, his sister, fought through the crowd to embrace her brother, whispering words of pride and support that only family could provide. But the victory was bittersweet. Each piece of evidence that vindicated James represented the suffering of real children, real families torn apart by Eleanor's greed and cruelty. The photographs and documents that prove his case also documented horrors that would haunt him forever. Eleanor's arrest came on a rainy Thursday morning 3 weeks after James's testimony. Armed police surrounded Buckingham Palace at dawn, serving warrants for charges including human trafficking, arms dealing, money laundering, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The woman who had worn crowns and tiaras was led away in handcuffs, her royal titles stripped by emergency parliamentary action. The king's statement, released hours after Eleanor's arrest, was brief but heartfelt. "The crown has been deeply wounded by these revelations, but justice must be served regardless of title or position. We owe Captain Morrison and the victims of these crimes our deepest gratitude and our commitment to ensuring such horrors never happen again under the protection of the monarchy." As evening fell on that historic day, James stood at the window of his temporary apartment, looking out at a London forever changed by his courage. The city lights twinkled like stars, each one representing lives that might now be safer because he had chosen to speak the truth. The cost had been enormous. His career, his home, his old life had all been sacrificed on the altar of justice. But as he thought of Amara and the other children whose stories had finally been heard, James knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. The working-class boy from Manchester had grown into a man who truly served something greater than himself, even when that service demanded everything he had to give. The third phase of the scandal was ending, but the healing was just beginning. Justice had prevailed, but the work of rebuilding trust and protecting the innocent would continue for years to come. 6 months after Eleanor's arrest, the criminal trial that captured global attention finally began at the Old Bailey. James Morrison sat in the witness gallery, no longer the uniformed guard he had been for over 2 decades, but a man whose courage had fundamentally changed the British monarchy forever. The months since filing his lawsuit had aged him visibly. Gray now streaked his dark hair, and lines of exhaustion marked his face, but his eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there during his years of silent complicity. Eleanor entered the courtroom in shackles, a stark contrast to the regal figure she had once presented to the world. The designer gowns and glittering jewelry had been replaced by a simple prison uniform. Her lawyers had advised her to maintain dignity throughout the proceedings, but the weight of overwhelming evidence had broken her composure. She appeared frail, defeated, a shadow of the woman who had once commanded rooms full of diplomats and celebrities. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor Sir David Hartwell, presented a case that read like a thriller novel, but was grounded in meticulous documentation. Bank records showed the flow of millions of pounds through shell companies and offshore accounts. Shipping manifests revealed how weapons were disguised as medical supplies and educational materials. Most damning of all were the recorded conversations between Eleanor and her criminal associates, planning operations with the cold efficiency of a multinational corporation. James's role as the key witness placed him at the center of intense media scrutiny once again. Death threats had forced him into protective custody, while supporters organized rallies calling for his recognition as a national hero. The polarization of public opinion remained intense, though polls consistently showed growing support for his actions as more evidence emerged. The most powerful testimony came from the victims themselves. Amara, the former child soldier from Somalia, traveled to London to face Eleanor in person. Now 16 and receiving psychological treatment, she spoke with a strength that belied her traumatic experiences. "I was 12 when your people took me from the orphanage," she said, looking directly at Eleanor. "You visited us 1 month before. You held my hand and told me I was beautiful. You took pictures with us for your charity website. Then you sold me to men who put a gun in my hands and taught me to kill." Eleanor refused to meet Amara's gaze, staring down at her hands as the young woman continued. "I killed people because you gave me no choice. I lost my childhood, my innocence, my faith in humanity. But I survived, and I am here to tell the world what you did to children like me." The courtroom was silent except for the soft sobbing of spectators. Even the judge, known for maintaining strict emotional control, was visibly affected by Amara's testimony. James found himself crying openly, overwhelmed by the courage of a young woman who had endured unimaginable trauma, but still found the strength to seek justice. Additional victims testified via video link from around the world. Children who had been trafficked, families who had been torn apart, communities devastated by conflicts fueled by Eleanor's weapons. Each story added another layer to the prosecution's case, painting a picture of systematic exploitation that spanned continents and destroyed thousands of lives. Eleanor's defense team, led by the expensive barrister Sir Reginald Blackwood, attempted to portray their client as a naive woman manipulated by criminal associates. They argued that her royal status made her a target for unscrupulous individuals who took advantage of her genuine desire to help charitable causes. "My client was guilty of nothing more than trusting the wrong people," Sir Reginald argued during opening statements. She believed she was supporting legitimate humanitarian work and was deceived about the true nature of these operations. To suggest that someone of her background and education would knowingly participate in such horrors is simply not credible. But this defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. Audio recordings revealed Eleanor's active participation in planning criminal operations. Financial records showed her personal enrichment from arms sales. Most damaging of all were emails in her own handwriting that discussed inventory management of children and market expansion in conflict zones with the casual tone of a business executive. Margaret Whitfield, now recognized as one of Britain's foremost human rights lawyers, systematically demolished the defense's arguments. She presented evidence showing Eleanor's direct involvement in every aspect of the criminal enterprise, from initial planning to profit distribution. The defendant wasn't naive, Margaret told the jury during her closing argument. She was the architect of a criminal empire that exploited the most vulnerable people on earth. She used her royal status, her charitable work, and even images of suffering children as tools to facilitate some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. James's testimony spanned 3 days and provided the crucial link between Eleanor's public persona and her criminal activities. He recounted specific conversations, described meetings he had witnessed, and explained how his growing awareness of her crimes had led to his decision to gather evidence. Captain Morrison, Sir Reginald challenged during cross-examination, isn't it true that you were motivated by jealousy of the defendant's position and wealth? Didn't you see this lawsuit as an opportunity for personal gain? James's response was quiet but devastating. Sir, I spent 23 years protecting people I serve with honor and pride. I gave up a comfortable retirement, security for my family, and a career I love to expose these crimes. I've received death threats, lived in hiding, and watched my reputation be destroyed in the press. If I wanted personal gain, there were much easier ways to achieve it than accusing a member of the royal family of trafficking children. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Eleanor finally took the stand in her own defense. Her lawyers had advised against it, but she insisted on speaking for herself. What followed was a disastrous performance that sealed her fate. Under direct examination, Eleanor attempted to maintain her innocence, claiming she had been deceived by criminal associates who exploited her charitable work. But under Margaret Whitfield's cross-examination, her composure completely collapsed. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, using Eleanor's former title with subtle irony, "you've claimed you were deceived about the nature of these operations. Can you explain why you personally visited child soldiers in training camps in 3 different countries?" Eleanor's response was barely coherent. "I was told they were educational facilities. I thought I was visiting schools." Margaret then played video footage taken by one of Eleanor's criminal associates, showing her at a facility where children as young as 10 were being trained to use assault rifles. In the video, Eleanor could be clearly heard discussing weapon specifications and delivery schedules. "Those children don't look like they're attending regular school, do they?" Margaret asked. Eleanor broke down completely, screaming accusations at James, at the prosecutors, at the legal system itself. She had to be removed from the courtroom by security guards while she ranted about conspiracies and betrayal. The image of the elegant Queen Consort had been replaced by that of a desperate criminal whose mask had finally slipped away entirely. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. Eleanor was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, one of the harshest sentences in British legal history. The judge's words echoed around the world. The defendant exploited her position of trust and influence to facilitate crimes against the most vulnerable members of human society. She profited from the suffering of children while presenting herself as their champion. Such profound betrayal of public trust and human decency demands the strongest possible response from our justice system. James felt no satisfaction in Eleanor's downfall, only relief that justice had finally been served for her victims. As he left the courthouse that day, he was surrounded by supporters who had followed the case from its beginning. Amara approached him with tears in her eyes and embraced him tightly. "Thank you for believing us," she whispered. "Thank you for having the courage we couldn't have." The aftermath of the trial brought significant changes to the British monarchy. Parliament passed comprehensive reforms requiring greater transparency in royal financial dealings and charitable activities. New oversight mechanisms were established to prevent the abuse of royal status for personal gain. The king himself testified before Parliament, accepting responsibility for the system's failures and committing to reforms that would restore public trust. James found himself in an unusual position as a hero to some and a traitor to others. He received numerous offers for book deals, movie rights, and television appearances, all of which he politely declined. Instead, he used his settlement money. The court had awarded him £50 million in damages to establish a foundation supporting child victims of trafficking and conflict. The James Morrison Foundation worked with international organizations to identify and rescue children caught in situations similar to those Eleanor had created. James personally traveled to some of the most dangerous places on Earth, using his military training and security expertise to help extract children from conflict zones and trafficking networks. His sister Sarah watched with pride and worry as her brother channeled his trauma into meaningful action. During one of their regular phone calls, she expressed concern about the risks he was taking in his new work. "Jamie, you've already done more than anyone could ask," she said. "You've exposed the truth, gotten justice for those children, and changed the monarchy forever. Don't you think you've given enough?" James was quiet for a moment, watching through his office window as London went about its daily business, forever changed by the events he had set in motion. "Sarah, for 23 years I was silent when I should have spoken. I was loyal when I should have been brave. I can't change the past, but I can make sure my future count for something." The Foundation's first major success came when they helped rescue 47 children from a trafficking network in Eastern Europe. Working with local authorities and international law enforcement, they dismantled an operation that had been exploiting children for 3 years. The moment when those children were reunited with their families was worth every sacrifice James had made. Dr. Patricia Williams, who continued to counsel James through his transition from royal guard to activist, marveled at his psychological transformation. "You've turned your trauma into purpose," she told him during one of their sessions. "Many people who witness what you witness become consumed by anger or despair. Instead, you've channeled your pain into protecting others." James's relationship with the royal family remained complicated. The king had privately thanked him for his courage while publicly maintaining necessary distance. Several younger royals had reached out through intermediaries to express their support, but James understood that official reconciliation was impossible. His actions had saved the monarchy from further scandal while simultaneously transforming it in ways that would take decades to fully understand. On the first anniversary of Eleanor's sentencing, James stood before a gathering of trafficking survivors and their families. The event was held at the Foundation's headquarters, a converted mansion in London that had once belonged to a corrupt arms dealer whose assets were seized during the investigation Eleanor's case had triggered. "A year ago, we gathered in a courtroom seeking justice," James told the assembled crowd. "Today, we gather in a place of healing, working to ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. Your courage in speaking out has changed the world. Your strength in surviving has inspired a movement for justice that will outlive all of us." Amara, now 17 and studying to become a human rights lawyer, spoke for the survivors. "Captain Morrison showed us that one person with courage can change everything. But he also showed us that courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose every day when you decide to do what's right instead of what's easy." As the evening concluded and the survivors and their families shared meals and stories of recovery, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The cost had been enormous. His career, his old life, his sense of security had all been sacrificed. But, in return, he had gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that he had served something truly greater than himself. The working-class boy from Manchester had become exactly what his father had hoped: a man who protected those who could not protect themselves, who chose justice over comfort, and who found his true calling in the service of others. The path had been harder than anything he could have imagined, but it had led him to a place of genuine honor and meaningful purpose. As London settled into another peaceful evening, James Morrison prepared for another day of fighting for those who had no voice, carrying forward the legacy of his courage into an uncertain but hopeful future. 5 years had passed since James Morrison first walked into Margaret Whitfield's law office with a briefcase full of evidence that would change British history forever. Now, as he stood in the garden of a rehabilitation center in Kenya, watching former child soldiers learn to read and write, the magnitude of what his courage had accomplished was impossible to ignore. The James Morrison Foundation had grown beyond anything he had originally envisioned. What began as a personal mission to help Eleanor's victims had evolved into a global network of safe houses, educational programs, and rehabilitation centers serving thousands of children rescued from trafficking and exploitation. The foundation operated in 27 countries, working closely with international law enforcement and human rights organizations to dismantle criminal networks that preyed on the vulnerable. Amara walked beside James as they toured the Kenya facility, now 21 and serving as the foundation's director of survivor support. Her transformation from traumatized child soldier to advocate and leader symbolized the healing that was possible when courage met compassion. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her voice steady as she explained the center's programs to visiting donors and government officials. "This is where we teach former soldiers to be children again," she explained to a group of European Union representatives who had come to study the Foundation's methods. "Many of these young people have never held a pencil, never played a game, never experienced safety. We give them time to heal and learn that there is more to life than violence." The rehabilitation process was long and complex. Children arrived at the centers carrying trauma that conventional therapy struggled to address. Many had been drugged to make them compliant, physically abused to ensure obedience, and psychologically manipulated to believe they were worthless outside of their role as weapons. The Foundation's approach combined traditional counseling with educational programs, artistic expression, and careful reintegration with their communities. James watched 12-year-old Marcus, a boy rescued from a militia group in the Democratic Republic of Congo, carefully drawing a picture of his village as he remembered it before the war. The child's hands, once forced to hold assault rifles, now gripped colored pencils as he created images of peace and home. Such moments reminded James why every sacrifice had been worthwhile. The ripple effects of Eleanor's exposure and prosecution had extended far beyond her personal crimes. International investigations, triggered by James's evidence, had uncovered corruption networks spanning dozens of countries. Arms dealers, corrupt officials, and trafficking organizations that had operated with impunity for decades found themselves facing prosecution in multiple jurisdictions. Conservative estimates suggested that over 10,000 children had been rescued as a direct result of the investigations James's courage had initiated. Margaret Whitfield, now serving as the Foundation's legal director pro bono, regularly updated James on the ongoing legal ramifications of his decision to speak out. Eleanor remained in prison, her appeals exhausted, and her criminal empire permanently dismantled. But, more importantly, the legal precedents established by her prosecution had made it much harder for similar operations to use charitable work and diplomatic immunity as cover for criminal activity. "The changes you've forced in international law will protect children for generations," Margaret told James during one of their monthly strategy meetings. Charitable organizations now face much stricter oversight. Diplomatic immunity can no longer shield obvious criminal activity, and, most importantly, whistleblowers like yourself have stronger legal protections. The British monarchy had undergone its own transformation in response to the scandal. The king, initially devastated by Eleanor's betrayal, had embraced comprehensive reforms that made the royal family more transparent and accountable than at any point in modern history. Royal finances were now subject to independent audit, charitable activities required government oversight, and a new position of royal ethics officer had been created to prevent future abuses. Surprisingly, the monarchy had emerged from the scandal stronger than before. Public opinion polls showed that the king's willingness to accept responsibility and implement meaningful reforms had actually increased respect for the institution. The contrast between Eleanor's corruption and the genuine charitable work of other royal family members had highlighted the importance of integrity in public service. James's relationship with his former colleagues in the Royal Guard remained complicated but was slowly healing. Many guards had initially felt betrayed by his decision to expose royal secrets, viewing it as a violation of their fundamental oath of loyalty. But as the full scope of Eleanor's crimes became clear, most came to understand that James had upheld the deeper meaning of their oath by protecting innocent lives. Commander Sarah Blackthorne, who had replaced James as head of the Queen Consort security detail and had been horrified to learn what she had unknowingly been protecting, visited him at the Foundation's London headquarters. "I spent 6 months protecting a monster and never knew it," she confessed, her usual military bearing softened by genuine emotion. I keep wondering if I should have seen the signs, if I failed in my duty to investigate further. James understood her guilt intimately. Sarah, Eleanor spent years perfecting her deception. She fooled diplomats, intelligence agencies, and international organizations that were specifically trained to detect such activities. The guilt belongs to her alone, not to the people she manipulated. Their conversation helped heal wounds that had festered within the Royal Guard community. Many of James's former colleagues began volunteering with the Foundation, using their security expertise to help protect rescued children and investigate ongoing trafficking operations. The skills they had developed protecting the monarchy found new purpose in defending the most vulnerable members of society. Dr. Patricia Williams continued to work with both James and many of the trafficking survivors, marveling at the resilience of the human spirit she witnessed daily. Her research on trauma recovery had been revolutionized by working with the Foundation's clients, leading to new therapeutic approaches that were being adopted worldwide. James, you've created something unprecedented, she told him during their 5th anniversary session. Most people who experience the kind of moral injury you suffered either break under the weight or become consumed by anger. Instead, you've channeled your trauma into healing, both your own and others. The personal cost of James's choice remained significant. His hair was now entirely gray despite his relatively young age, and the stress of his work had left permanent marks on his face. He lived modestly, using most of his settlement money to fund the Foundation's operations. Romantic relationships had proven difficult, as few people could understand the weight of responsibility he carried or the dangers his work sometimes required him to face. But he had found a different kind of family among the survivors and their advocates. Sarah, his sister, often joked that he had adopted thousands of children around the world, and in many ways that was true. The Foundation's alumni stayed in touch, sharing their successes and challenges as they rebuilt their lives. James received letters, emails, and video calls from young people pursuing education, starting families, and building peaceful futures that had once seemed impossible. One of the most touching relationships was with David, a former child soldier from Sierra Leone who had been rescued during the Foundation's 2nd year of operation. Now 25 and working as a civil engineer, David had married and started a family of his own. He named his firstborn son James, a gesture that moved the Foundation's founder to tears. "You gave me back my humanity," David explained during a video call from his home in Freetown. "When you rescued me, I didn't remember my real name or my family. I thought I was only good for fighting and killing. Now I build bridges and schools instead of destroying them. My son will never know war because of what you started." International recognition for James's work had come from multiple sources. He had received Human Rights Award from the United Nations, the European Parliament, and numerous national governments. Universities offered him honorary degrees. Peace organizations invited him to speak at conferences, and world leaders sought his advice on combating human trafficking. But the recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source. On the 5th anniversary of Eleanor's sentencing, James received a private letter from Buckingham Palace. The king, writing in his personal capacity rather than in his official role, expressed gratitude for James's courage and acknowledged the monarchy's debt to his integrity. "Your decision to speak the truth, regardless of personal cost, saved not only the innocent victims of these crimes, but also the honor of the crown itself," the king wrote. "History will remember you as a man who chose justice over loyalty, courage over comfort, and the protection of children over personal security. The monarchy you served faithfully for 23 years owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." The letter was never made public, but it represented a personal vindication that James treasured more than any official award or recognition. As autumn arrived in London, James prepared for the Foundation's annual gala, an event that brought together survivors, donors, government officials, and advocates from around the world. This year's theme was From Darkness to Light, celebrating both the journey of individual survivors and the broader transformation that collective courage had achieved. The evening began with testimonials from Foundation alumni who had rebuilt their lives in remarkable ways. Former child soldiers had become teachers, doctors, engineers, and advocates. Children who had been trafficked for exploitation had earned university degrees, started businesses, and were raising families of their own. Each story represented not just personal triumph, but a victory against the forces of darkness that Eleanor had embodied. James's keynote address reflected on the journey from that morning 5 years ago when he had first decided to speak out. When I walked into Margaret Whitfield's office with evidence of crimes I could no longer ignore, I thought I was ending my life as I knew it, he told the assembled crowd. I was right, my old life did end. But in its place, I found something I never could have imagined. A purpose that gives meaning to every sacrifice, a family that spans the globe, and the knowledge that courage, once chosen, becomes a force that can transform the world. He paused, looking out at faces that represented hope emerging from despair, healing growing from trauma, and love conquering fear. The children we've helped rescue and rehabilitate are proof that no matter how dark the circumstances, no matter how powerful the forces of evil, courage combined with compassion can create miracles. You've all become miracle workers in your own right, and I am honored to serve alongside you in this vital work. The gala raised over £3 million for the Foundation's operations, but more importantly, it demonstrated the global community that had formed around James's initial act of courage. Government officials pledged increased support for anti-trafficking efforts. Religious leaders committed to raising awareness in their communities, and business leaders offered resources for survivor rehabilitation programs. As the evening concluded, James found himself on the terrace of the venue, looking out over London's skyline. The city lights twinkled like stars, each one representing lives touched by the work that had grown from his decision to choose courage over silence. Amara joined him, now a poised young woman whose own journey from victim to advocate embodied the transformation that was possible when courage met compassion. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up your old life to expose the truth?" James considered the question seriously. His old life had offered security, respect, and comfort. His new life brought constant challenges, emotional difficulties, and the weight of responsibility for thousands of vulnerable people around the world. "Amara, regret is for choices that harm others or betray our principles," he said finally. "I regret that it took me so long to find the courage to act. I regret that children suffered while I remained silent. But I will never regret choosing to protect innocent lives over my own comfort." She nodded, understanding born from her own journey toward healing and purpose. "You taught us that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite the fear." As London settled into another peaceful night, James Morrison reflected on the path that had led him from a working-class boy with dreams of honor to a man who had redefined what honor truly meant. The Royal Guard oath he had sworn decades ago had spoken of protecting the crown, but he had learned that true protection sometimes required challenging the very institution he served. His father's words, spoken so many years ago, echoed in his memory. "You'll serve something greater than yourself, son." The factory worker from Manchester could never have imagined how prophetic those words would prove to be. His son had indeed served something greater than himself. He had served justice, compassion, and the fundamental belief that every child deserved protection from those who would exploit their vulnerability. The story that began with a young man's oath to serve the crown had evolved into something far more profound, a testament to the power of individual courage to transform not just personal destiny, but the fate of thousands of innocent lives around the world. James Morrison's legacy would live on in every child who found safety because someone had chosen to speak the truth, regardless of the cost. The working-class boy from Manchester had become exactly what his father had envisioned, and far more than either of them had ever dared to dream. In choosing courage over comfort, truth over silence, and justice over loyalty, he had found his true calling and created a legacy that would protect the innocent for generations to come.